The first time Gabriel saw Giovanna, he didn't quite understand what he felt. It was in the second year of high school, between switching classrooms from math to biology. She was rushing down the hallway, notebooks clutched tightly against her chest, her ponytail swinging like a ribbon caught in the wind. And suddenly, the world seemed to slow down. Gabriel, always quiet, his face usually hidden behind a book or headphones, had never really stopped to notice anyone at school like that. But something about her eyes, brown and deep, calm and fleeting, as they briefly met his, completely disarmed him, as if life itself had whispered, "Pay attention, because this is where everything begins." Giovanna wasn't the kind of girl who stood out for being popular. She stood out because of her presence. Always polite, with a gentle smile and a sweet voice, she treated everyone with kindness, even those who didn't deserve it. She sat in the second seat of the right-hand row, by the window. Gabriel sat 2 rows behind. For weeks, he just watched her from a distance. He noticed how she doodled flowers along the edges of her notebook, how she scrunched her nose when she was focused, how she drew tiny hearts beside her name. He memorized her handwriting before he ever heard her voice up close. Their first interaction happened by chance, or maybe fate. During a literature class, the teacher assigned a paired activity. To Gabriel's astonishment, he was paired with Giovanna. His heart raced, his hands were sweaty, and for the first time he wished that class could last forever. They worked together analyzing a poem by Drummond, and that's when they discovered something rare. The silence between them was comforting, as if their souls had known each other long before. Giovanna shared that she liked writing, and Gabriel revealed he wanted to become a teacher. Between verses and metaphors, a connection was born. In the days that followed, they started talking more, first during breaks, then through messages, and then came the notes passed during class. Small folded papers with silly phrases, inside jokes, crude little drawings filled with affection. It was a light, innocent, growing bond. Gabriel began to look forward to recess just to see her smile. Giovanna started searching for his eyes, even when they were in separate groups. And when their fingers brushed for the first time as they both reached for the same book in the library, the world seemed to stop spinning, just for a second, just for the two of them. Their first kiss came on a rainy Friday afternoon. The school was nearly empty. Most students had already gone home. They were waiting under the awning, listening to the rhythm of the raindrops filling the silence. Gabriel, nervous, clutched his backpack tightly. Giovanna looked at him with a spark in her eyes, as if she already knew what he was about to do. Without saying a word, he stepped closer, heart pounding wildly, and kissed her. A tender kiss, hesitant but filled with a feeling far too real to be put into words. When they pulled away, both smiled like someone who's finally found shelter after a long storm. From that day on, they were inseparable. They worked on assignments together, studied for exams, ate lunch side by side in the cafeteria. Gabriel wrote poems for her. Giovanna recorded videos reading passages from his favorite books. It was as if the world outside no longer mattered as long as they were together. And even with all the uncertainties youth brings, there was a quiet certainty between them. This was love. But time, relentless as always, was already preparing its tests. College entrance exams were approaching. Their dreams were pulling them in opposite directions. And though they didn't know it yet, that sweet chapter was just the prologue to a much bigger story. The kind of story life writes with tears and resilience. But that begins with a kiss in the rain, and a love born in the halls of an ordinary school. The months leading up to the college entrance exams felt like a constant tightness in Gabriel and Giovanna's chests. Even though they smiled during their meetups, studied together, and pretended everything was normal in the school hallways, something unspoken hung heavy in the air. They both knew that the end of the school year wouldn't just mean the end of classes. It would mark the beginning of a new chapter, and maybe the start of a distance neither of them wanted to face. Giovanna had been accepted into a federal nursing program in the countryside of Minas Gerais. Gabriel, into literature, in a capital city over 400 kilometers away. The news came as both a victory and a punch to the gut. On the night they found out their futures were drawn on maps so far apart, they met in the same spot where they had shared their first kiss, under the school's awning. It was raining again, as if the sky understood the ache they carried. Giovanna clutched her enrollment paper with trembling hands. Gabriel stared at the ground, as if avoiding the future. She was the one to break the silence first, her voice breaking. "I'm happy, but my heart is in pieces." And he answered, gripping her hands tightly. We'll find a way. A love that survives distance can survive anything. They made promises. So many. That they'd visit each other whenever possible. That they'd send letters. Not just messages, but real, handwritten letters. That they'd call each other every night. That they'd be strong. But no promise, no matter how sincere, could silence the fear hiding in their eyes. The fear of time, of routine, of new friendships, of being forgotten. Because young love, no matter how powerful, is still fragile in the face of the adult world creeping in. The farewell happened at the bus station, on a gray January day. Giovanna left first. Gabriel stood there, watching the bus disappear around the bend, as if it had taken half of him with it. He went home carrying a deafening silence inside. In the beginning, the messages were constant, the calls long and filled with, "I miss you," and "I can't wait to see you again." But slowly, schedules stopped aligning. Exams, assignments, new classmates, commitments. Life began to wedge itself between them, as if testing whether their love could truly endure. Giovanna cried at night, hiding from her roommate, staring at old photos on her phone. Gabriel wrote letters he never sent, tucked away in a box under his bed. They loved each other deeply, yet felt powerless against the circumstances. Gabriel's last visit to Giovanna's town was during a long weekend. The reunion was intense, desperate, passionate, but it was also heartbreaking, because they both felt, without saying a word, that something was slipping away. On the last day, embraced at the bus station, Giovanna whispered, "If life ever wants it, it'll bring us back together." And he replied, eyes full of tears, "And when it does, I won't let you go again." Time passed. 3 years, then 4, then 5, and life, relentless, swept them in different directions. Giovanna graduated and began working in public hospitals, facing long and painful shifts. Gabriel became a teacher at a public school, writing in his spare time, trying to fill the emptiness she had left. They lived other stories, met other people, but in every new smile, there was always a quiet comparison. No one was quite like the other, and no love that followed was ever strong enough to erase what they had shared. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to find out that destiny has its own ways of fulfilling old promises, and that some loves, even if asleep for years, never really die. They just wait for the right moment to begin again. Time had passed, but not like a wave that washes everything away. Time passed like the wind, rearranging the dust without erasing the marks left on the ground. Gabriel and Giovanna had moved on with their lives, but each step echoed something old. In every new laugh, there was a quiet absence. He taught literature to teenagers and, every now and then, found himself quoting poems about reunions and longing. She, in the cold hallways of hospitals, cared for patients who often had no one. And on exhausted nights, staring at the ceiling, she wondered if he still thought of her. Life seemed settled, but never satisfied. Gabriel lived alone in a small apartment that smelled of old books. He wrote scattered texts about loves lost between the lines of time. Giovanna shared a place with a coworker and spent her free hours visiting a nonprofit that cared for children with cancer. They were alive, functional, busy, but not whole. There was a part of them that never fit with anyone else again, and even though they tried to convince themselves that this is just how life is, a part of their hearts still beat for something they couldn't even name. Then came an ordinary afternoon downtown, when fate, with all its poetic irony, decided to intervene. Gabriel stepped into a bookstore to buy a gift for his niece. The scent of new pages, the tall shelves, the soft instrumental music, it all made him feel at home. He wandered through the aisles, flipping through a book of short stories, when he heard a soft, familiar laugh that struck him like lightning. Slowly, he lifted his eyes, and there, in the contemporary literature section, was her, Giovanna, her hair shorter, her face a bit more mature, and her eyes exactly the same. Brown, bright, familiar. Once again, the world seemed to stop. Neither of them knew what to say at first. They just looked at each other, as if trying to believe it was real. Giovanna was the first to break the silence, with an emotional whisper. "Gabriel?" He answered with a trembling smile. "I thought you were just a beautiful memory." She laughed, her eyes glistening. "I thought of you yesterday." And in that moment, there was no lost time, no past or future. Just the two of them, whole again, even if only for an instant. They had coffee on the corner, talked about everything and nothing, laughed at old school stories, shared losses and triumphs. Time, once a villain, had now become an accomplice. The conversation flowed as if it had never paused, and when their fingers touched over the table, they understood. This wasn't just a casual reunion. It was the beginning of a return, the rescue of a story still very much alive. Life, in all its force, was giving them a second chance. In the days that followed, meeting up became a routine. Walks in the park, movie nights, late-night messages. But now, there was something different. They were no longer the teenagers who once promised each other forever. They were adults, weathered by life, aware of what it could take away. And for that reason, every gesture was more intense. Every gaze, deeper. Giovanna took him to the school where she worked. Gabriel joined her for a talk she gave on palliative care. They admired each other in new ways, rediscovering one another from the inside out. And when, one night, Gabriel walked her home and said, looking into her eyes, "I never stopped loving you," Giovanna answered with a long kiss and a tear resting on her lashes. There were no more promises about the future, only decisions in the present. And this time, neither of them was willing to waste another second. This time, they wouldn't let life slip through their fingers. Their reunion wasn't just a beautiful accident, it was a calling. Gabriel and Giovanna dove back into love with the kind of maturity only time and pain can teach. There were no more games, no childish fears, no insecurities hidden behind smiles. Now, their love had roots. It was made of memories, yes, but also of concrete, conscious, adult choices. And that solidity gave their relationship a new kind of glow. Not the spark of youthful infatuation, but a complete, grounded, and deliberate love. Their days unfolded with the sweetness of simple joys. Sunday breakfast together, holding hands in the grocery store, assembling new furniture in the small apartment Gabriel had rented, the same one where Giovanna now spent most nights. He cooked simple dinners, she left notes on the bathroom mirror. They laughed at the same jokes, cried at the same movies. One rainy weekend, they watched their old graduation video under the covers, a clip where they were both laughing side by side. Giovanna, eyes glistening, whispered, "We were so young, and look at us now. We survived time." That night, they decided, they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. No extravagance, no big ceremony, just the certainty that they wouldn't get another chance like this. They bought simple silver rings, engraved with their names inside. Gabriel proposed at the place where it had all begun, the old school's awning, now an abandoned building, still standing, like a symbol of a love that had endured everything. He knelt, she cried, and her yes came with the power of someone who had waited years to say it. The wedding was intimate. 30 guests, a modest hall rented with the help of friends, a cake made by Giovanna's aunt, and music played by one of Gabriel's former students. Yet the ceremony was breathtaking. Giovanna walked in wearing a dress she had altered herself. Gabriel wore a borrowed suit and had the most loving gaze anyone had ever seen. When it came time for the vows, he said, "I waited for you all these years, and now, I don't want to wait for anything. I just want to live it all with you." She replied, "You were my first love, and now, you're the love of my life." The whole room wept, even the waiters. Right after the wedding, they began planning their future. They opened a joint bank account, saved every penny they could, dreamed of buying a little house in the countryside, a used car for weekend getaways, maybe even opening a small literary cafe. Giovanna wanted to continue her work with palliative care patients. Gabriel dreamed of writing a book about love and second chances. They were excited, hopeful, living a kind of rebirth. Everything finally seemed to be falling into place. But life, as unpredictable as it is generous, was about to change everything. And it would be precisely when happiness seemed complete that fate would place before them the hardest battle they had ever faced. The day began with a sky veiled in gentle clouds, as if even the weather chose to honor the delicacy of that moment. There was no sun, no rain, just a soft breeze that drifted slowly through the curtains of the small apartment where Giovanna was getting ready for her wedding. She sat before the mirror of an old vanity, her eyes fixed on her own reflection, though her mind wandered, lost in memories of handwritten notes at school, silent afternoons filled with longing, and whispered promises at the bus station years before. Now, here she was, wearing a simple dress of light lace, one she had altered with the same hands that had cared for so many others. It wasn't the kind of dress seen in magazines, but it was hers, and that was enough. Across town, Gabriel was putting on his borrowed suit, trying to steady his trembling hands. His sister helped with the tie while he stared out the window, almost unable to believe it was all real. He thought of everything they had lived through, the missed chances, the sleepless nights, the letters never sent. And now, finally, destiny had allowed their story to take a joyful turn. His heart pounded, not with anxiety, but with the peace of someone who knows they are walking towards something true. There was no doubt, no rush, just love. The reception hall was small, decorated with wildflowers picked by Giovanna herself with the help of her childhood friend. There were no chandeliers, no candelabras, no red carpet, but there was warmth. There was care in every detail. The photo frames holding old pictures of the two of them, the dessert table prepared by Gabriel's grandmother, the simple two-tiered cake with the words, "Forever at last," written in delicate golden script by hand. The guests were few, but essential. True friends, family who had followed their journey, students and colleagues who knew this wedding was more than a ceremony. It was a reunion with hope. When Giovanna entered, everyone stood. A hush fell over the room. She walked slowly, without a veil, her hair delicately pinned up, her eyes shining with emotion. Gabriel stood waiting beneath an altar made of paper flowers and Christmas lights. The moment he saw her, a lump rose in his throat and nearly stole his breath. She smiled, and in that instant, he knew there was nothing more beautiful in the world than this. Nothing more pure, nothing more right. Their vows were handwritten, like the notes they had exchanged as teenagers. Gabriel began by saying he never forgot the scent of her perfume in the school hallways, that he had waited each day, believing he might still get a chance, and that now, older, steadier, more of a man, he promised to never let go of her hand again. Giovanna spoke with a trembling voice, promising love on hard days, laughter on good ones, and courage on cloudy ones. "You were my first home," she said, "even when everything around me was uncertain. And now, I want to be yours, for the rest of our lives." They kissed amid applause, tears, and quiet sighs. And that night, they danced beneath warm yellow lights, barefoot with full hearts. There was no luxury, but there was everything. What they were building wasn't just a wedding. It was a story of reunion, of choice, of love that refuses to surrender to time. They were at last on the same side of the road, ready to walk together, even without knowing that, a few months later, that road would turn rough, dark, and merciless. But that night, none of that mattered. There, in that humble hall, two souls finally found each other at the right time, and that was enough. Everything finally seemed at peace. Gabriel and Giovanna woke up each morning with gratitude in their eyes. Breakfasts were shared between kisses and toast. Their days flowed between work routines and dreams for the future. They saved coins in a jar labeled "Our Little House" and envisioned a small porch, hanging plants, and the sound of rain on the roof. They didn't want riches, they wanted peace, and they were willing to build it with their own hands, one step at a time. But life, with its silent brutality, has a habit of testing the hearts that love the most, and theirs would be no exception. It started with a light discomfort in Giovanna's left breast. Small, almost unnoticeable, a tiny lump she only discovered by accident during a shower. At first, she didn't think much of it, thought it might be hormonal, something related to her cycle. But days went by, and the discomfort lingered. Gabriel insisted she see a doctor. She resisted, like someone avoiding a truth they already fear, but she booked it. One exam, then another, and then the biopsy. The world, once made of plans and hopes, began to crack. They were sitting in the white office when the doctor, her voice trained to soften tragedies, spoke the words no couple should hear at the beginning of their life together. "Advanced stage breast cancer. Aggressive." Giovanna froze. Gabriel felt pins and needles in his hands. Neither of them reacted right away. The doctor kept talking, mentioning protocols, statistics, treatment options, chances of recovery. But it all sounded like noise. Their hearts were beating in a rhythm that no longer matched the world outside. Giovanna didn't cry on the way out. She stared at the ground in silence. Gabriel tried to hold her hand, but she instinctively pulled away, like someone afraid to shatter at the slightest touch. They walked to the car without a word, and only when they were home did she collapse. She dropped to her knees in the middle of the living room and screamed as if the ground had been ripped from beneath her. Gabriel, overcome by a pain he couldn't name, hugged her from behind, silently, allowing her to fall apart in his arms. That scream, raw, desperate, marked the beginning of the fight. The days that followed were a blur of tests, hospital visits, meetings with oncologists. Giovanna lost her appetite. Gabriel lost sleep. The full diagnosis came like a sentence: triple-negative carcinoma, one of the most difficult types to treat. The protocol would require intense chemotherapy, followed by surgery and radiation. Time was short. The cancer was moving fast. They had no private insurance. The public system was slow. Their carefully saved wedding funds were suddenly rerouted to private consultations, expensive tests, emergency biopsies. The little house jar was emptied in silence. Gabriel juggled work and caregiving. He made soups when she couldn't eat, helped wash her hair before each chemo session, already bracing for the inevitable hair loss. He slept on the floor beside her bed on the nights when pain made her cry out. Giovanna tried to stay strong, but the mirror became her enemy. Each fallen strand of hair, each dark circle under her eyes, every new mark on her body, it all felt like a cruel reminder that something inside her was trying to destroy her. And even with all of Gabriel's love, there were moments she felt alone, fragile, ugly, almost a shadow of who she once was. The first chemo session was brutal. Nausea, fever, dizziness, a hollowness that took over her body. Gabriel held her hand for hours at the hospital, brought books, music, kind words. But deep down, he knew no word was enough. Cancer had become the third element in their marriage, an intruder, an invisible enemy that demanded everything: body, soul, money, faith. And they didn't have much. But what they had, they gave completely. That's when the real fight began. Not just against the illness, but against fear, against the looming idea of loss, against the temptation to give up. Because true love doesn't live only on flowers and promises. It lives in what you do when the world begins to fall apart. And they were about to prove that there was something stronger than cancer within that home. A love that would not back down. The hospital became an extension of their home. The oncology waiting room, with its scent of antiseptic and cold coffee, was now the backdrop of Gabriel and Giovanna's daily lives. The white walls seemed to close in over time. The hallways, where wheelchairs rolled and tired smiles passed, echoed with a heavy, almost reverent silence. Giovanna arrived for each chemotherapy session with a steady gaze on the outside, but inside carried a weariness that no words could soothe. Gabriel was always by her side, a backpack slung over his shoulder, carrying saltine crackers, juice boxes, and books of poetry, as if he could soften the chaos with verses. Chemo came like a storm. The first few days after each treatment were the worst. Fever, chills, relentless vomiting, aching bones, and a soul-crushing exhaustion. Giovanna tried to hide the suffering behind fleeting smiles, but sometimes she collapsed in Gabriel's arms, whispering, "I just want one normal day, just one." He held her without speaking, as if silence could shield her. And deep down, he felt guilty for being healthy, for not being able to take her pain, for being forced to simply watch the woman he loved be slowly torn apart by something he couldn't touch. With each new session, Giovanna's body grew more fragile. Her hair began to fall out in clumps, first on the pillow, then the bathroom floor, and finally in her own hands. One night was particularly difficult. She cried on the bathroom floor, surrounded by strands of herself. When Gabriel walked in and saw her there, something inside him shattered, but he didn't let the pain win. He grabbed the electric razor, knelt before her, and silently began to shave his own head. "If you're going through this, then I'm going through it with you. Every part of you is a part of me." Giovanna sobbed, and for the first time in weeks, smiled from the heart. Medical bills began to pile up. Their wedding savings were gone. They sold the car, canceled the dream of opening the cafe, asked friends for help, started a crowdfunding campaign. Some stepped up, others vanished. Their dignity, wounded, was swallowed daily by bills, receipts, and due dates. Gabriel started giving private lessons at night, after spending the day by her side. He slept 3, maybe 4 hours a night, but he said he wouldn't trade that effort for anything. "If it means keeping you alive, I'll endure whatever it takes." In the hardest moments, Giovanna thought about giving up. There were nights she'd say she was tired, that she didn't recognize herself in the mirror anymore, that she wasn't a woman, that she wasn't herself. And in those moments, Gabriel would hold her face in his hands, look into her hollow eyes, and say firmly, "You are the most alive woman I've ever known. And if you forget that, I'll remind you every single day. That kind of love kept them standing when everything else was falling apart. They turned their home into a sanctuary of survival. Post-it notes with words of encouragement covered the kitchen. Colorful blankets on the couch, warm tea at night, a tiny orchid on the windowsill that Giovanna named Resilience. Each day was a battle. Every pain-free moment of sleep was a victory. And every hug exchanged at the end of the day was a reminder that, even as her body was under attack, their souls remained unbreakable. Chemotherapy continued, session after session, like a countdown to hope. And despite the suffering, something was growing between them. A silent, almost sacred certainty that they were stronger, more united, more alive. Because in the end, their love wasn't just surviving cancer. It was defeating fear, pain, and despair. And though the road ahead was still long, they both knew they were walking it side by side. And as long as that was true, there was still light. The days began to repeat like a painful symphony. Hospital, home, medicine, tears, hope, hospital again. Time was now measured in scans and results, and the clock of life seemed to spin inside a test tube. Giovanna was exhausted. The treatment left her body weaker each day, and even the rare moments of relief came laced with a silent fear. The fear that it wasn't working. Her skin was pale. Her eyebrows had vanished. Her clothes hung loose. And most of all, the light in her eyes had started to fade. There were mornings when she simply couldn't get out of bed. Not because of pain, but because she couldn't find a reason to rise. She'd lie for hours staring at the ceiling, silent, hands over her thin chest, heart full of questions with no answers. Gabriel would try to start conversations, cook something gentle, play music, but there was a kind of silence no sound could reach. An existential stillness, the kind that makes one ask why they were chosen to endure such pain. A silence that felt like slowly ceasing to exist to herself. Then, on a February night, came the collapse. It was raining, and inside their apartment, thick with humid heat, Giovanna broke. She screamed, cried, threw pillows to the floor, said she couldn't do it anymore, that she didn't want more medicine, that she didn't want to keep fighting, that she'd rather go than keep being a shadow of the woman she once was. Gabriel stood still in the doorway, the world spinning, but he didn't rush to her, didn't try to stop the storm. He let her scream, let her pour out the venom of her soul. And when she finally fell into silence, on her knees on the floor, he knelt beside her and said the only thing that made sense: "Then I'll fight for us, even when you can't." The next morning, he left without saying where he was going. He returned in the early afternoon with a plain box in his hands. He called Giovanna into the living room, and there, under her curious and still sad gaze, he opened the box. Inside were a hair clipper, 2 glasses of cheap wine, and a handwritten letter. He turned on the clippers, handed them to her, and said, "You've lost so much, but you won't lose this alone. Shave mine." Giovanna tried to resist, but he insisted. And there, with trembling hands, she ran the blade through his dark hair. When she finished, he picked up the letter and read it aloud. It was a poem, written by him, about hair that falls, but roots that stay, about the beauty of survival, and above all, about a love that chooses to stay even when everything else begins to fall apart. That was the day Giovanna began to return, not because her body was healing, but because her soul felt embraced again. They began doing small rituals together, watching the sunset from the kitchen window, listening to old Elis Regina albums, painting mandalas, writing letters to each other. Little gestures that, together, built an invisible shield against despair. Gabriel placed a note on the bathroom mirror. "The woman you are now is even more beautiful than the one I first met." Giovanna cried when she read it, but not out of sadness, out of recognition, out of finding herself again. She slowly started smiling again, began looking at her reflection without turning away, started writing in her memory journal, visited the NGO where she used to volunteer, now as a patient who inspired others. And with every step she took, even if shaky, there was certainty. She wasn't alone. Because even when she wanted to give up, Gabriel refused to let love die. They still didn't know what the future tests would reveal. But in that moment, for the first time in weeks, there was more than pain in that home. There was light, there was breath, there was faith, and above all, there was a love that refused to merely exist. A love that chose, every single day, to keep fighting. The last chemotherapy session wasn't marked by celebration. There were no fireworks, no posters at the hospital, no euphoric smiles. It was just another ordinary day, the same metallic chill of the stretcher, The same smell of alcohol in the air, the same IV dripping into Giovanna's frail arm. But within her, and within Gabriel, that moment carried a weight the world couldn't see. It was the end of a chapter, a cycle that once felt endless, now leaving its marks not only on the body, but on the soul. It was like crossing a desert barefoot and finally glimpsing the horizon, still uncertain, but real. Giovanna arrived at the hospital wearing a floral scarf, a gift from a fellow patient she'd met in previous sessions. Gabriel carried a hot coffee and a book of poetry by Manuel de Barros. He sat beside her, as always, and held her hand the entire time. They didn't exchange many words. Their eyes spoke more than conversation could. Between them was a kind of silent reverence, as if both understood they were witnessing something sacred, survival. After the last drop of medication, Giovanna cried, not from pain, but from the memory of everything they had lived through. The days she thought she'd never see the sun again, the nights when she wished she could disappear, the moments when Gabriel held her even as she broke. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice cracking. Gabriel just smiled, squeezed her hand tightly, and whispered, "Now life begins." The following days were filled with waiting. Each week, a new exam. Each exam, a suffocating wave of anticipation. The doctor ordered a full battery of tests to evaluate the treatment's outcome. Giovanna went through them all, eyes misty, heart swinging between faith and terror. Gabriel, as always, was by her side, but he trembled inside. He knew their future now depended on reports and images, on medical language and statistics. He tried to stay strong for her, but when he was alone, in the bathroom, in the dark, he cried. The final results arrived on a morning of clear skies. The doctor's office was cold as usual. Giovanna sat before the doctor, Gabriel beside her. The doctor, with the calm of someone who's seen 1,000 stories unfold between life and death, opened the folder, took a deep breath, and said, "Giovanna, you are in complete remission." For a moment, the world stopped. The clock's hands stilled. Time held its breath. She didn't react right away. She simply looked at him, as if not understanding. Gabriel cried first, covering his face with both hands, letting out a muffled sob. Giovanna then began to laugh, a shy, nervous, relieved laugh, as if testing whether the moment was real. The doctor smiled. "This doesn't mean it's over forever, but it means you've made it through the hardest part. And that's huge." They embraced right there, in the office. A long, intense, uncontrollable cry. Giovanna trembled. Gabriel held her like she might vanish. And deep down, they both knew. They had just come back to life. But what now? They had won. But their hands were empty. The money was gone. The savings depleted. The car, sold. The rent, overdue. Their dreams, the house, the cafe, the plans, all shelved. They had sacrificed everything to survive. And now, standing in victory, they would have to start over. But there was one powerful difference. They were alive. Together. Whole. And that was worth more than anything. That night, lying on the mattress in the living room, they ate bread with butter and sipped tea. And there, with exhausted bodies and unburdened hearts, Giovanna looked at Gabriel and said, "If we beat death, we can beat anything." He smiled and replied, "From now on, everything is profit." And under the soft light of the lamp, they fell asleep in each other's arms, without fear of tomorrow, because they knew tomorrow finally existed again, starting over. A word that sounds simple, but for Gabriel and Giovanna, carried the weight of everything they had lost, and the promise of everything they could still build. After remission, there was no time for luxury celebrations, no trips, no champagne toasts. The battle had left visible and invisible scars. The home was now emptier. The bank account, nearly non-existent. The furniture, reduced to essentials. But within that modest space, there was something money could never buy, a second chance. In the first days after treatment ended, Giovanna slept a lot. Her body was still healing. Gabriel respected her pace. He cooked, cleaned, managed their finances, or what was left of them, and simply sat beside his wife, holding her in silence. Sometimes they cried together, not from pain, but from relief. The kind of tears that fall slowly, almost soundless, like a whispered prayer to the universe. With what little they had, they decided to leave the expensive apartment they could no longer afford. They rented a small house in a humble neighborhood, but it had a charming porch. It was modest, but it had natural light, a cherry tree in the backyard, and space to grow flowers. It was there, in that new shelter, that they promised to rebuild everything from the ground up, brick by brick, day by day. Giovanna, now in recovery, began writing about her journey. She started a small blog, at first just to share feelings, then to help other women going through the same thing. Her words, honest and human, began to spread. She received messages from all over Brazil, patients, wives, sons, caregivers, all touched by her strength and sincerity. Soon she was invited to speak, in churches, schools, hospitals. She spoke not only of pain, but of hope. And in every talk she repeated, "Love saved my life, not the romantic kind, but real love, the kind that stays when the body falls." Gabriel, meanwhile, finally wrote his book, a poetic narrative weaving together memories of adolescence, old-school notes, days in the hospital, and the silences of beginning again. Giovanna chose the title, As Long as There's Us. It was published by a small press. The book didn't become a bestseller, but it deeply touched those who read it. He received letters from readers saying they found healing between the lines. And that, to him, was worth more than any bestseller list. The hardships continued. Bills to pay, overdue installments, sleepless nights. But now, there was purpose. There was direction. Giovanna planted a small vegetable garden in the yard. Gabriel hung a swing from the cherry tree. Little by little, the smiles came more often. Music returned. The once bare walls were now covered with drawings, notes, and photographs. The house, though humble, had become a home full of memories rebuilt with courage. One evening, sitting on the porch with warm tea in hand, they watched the sunset's red glow. Giovanna rested her head on Gabriel's shoulder and asked, "Do you still want that literary cafe?" He laughed and said, "I do, and I wanted to have your name on the door." She smiled, and in that simple exchange, they recognized each other. They were no longer the same teenagers from school, nor the same adults from the altar. They were survivors, and survivors, more than anyone, know the value of now. They chose not to plan life in leaps, but in small steps. They started with a charity yard sale, then reading circles for neighbors and friends. The community came closer. They received donations. They gave affection. The love that saved them now overflowed beyond their four walls. And that, to them, was true wealth. Because starting over didn't mean going back to the beginning. It meant moving forward with everything they had learned. With more scars, yes, but also with more strength, more truth, more love. And in that simple home, scented with fresh bread and hope, Gabriel and Giovanna proved to the world, and to themselves, that true love doesn't just survive pain and time. It is reborn, stronger, more beautiful, more real. Life was never the same again for Gabriel and Giovanna, and thank goodness for that. Because the life they built after the pain was deeper, more conscious, more meaningful than any dream they had ever imagined. They didn't return to the starting point. They went beyond, more mature, more human, more grateful. They had learned, with each tear shed on the cold tile of the hospital, that happiness doesn't lie in the absence of problems, but in the strength with which we choose to face them together. That true love doesn't survive on promises, but on presence, on holding hands in the darkest hour, on silence respected, on tears shared. Giovanna's body carries scars, some visible, others not, but she learned to see them as medals, marks of a war she won with dignity and tenderness. Gabriel, in turn, discovered that being strong isn't about not feeling. It's about feeling everything and still staying, still choosing to love, even when everything around you is falling apart. And that's what held them together. On their wedding anniversaries, they don't exchange expensive gifts. They give each other handwritten letters, notes left under the pillow, looks that say, "I know what we've been through, and I choose to love you even more because of it." Some nights, they sit out in the yard and read aloud from Giovanna's old blog or excerpts from Gabriel's book. Sometimes they laugh, sometimes they cry, but always, they give thanks, because they're still there, together, whole, even if stitched together. And when people ask how they managed to endure so much, they usually answer with simplicity. We didn't let go, even when everything told us to. And maybe that's what true love really is. Not the kind that avoids pain, but the kind that walks through it without running. The love that isn't in a hurry, that doesn't demand perfection, that never gives up. One day, maybe they'll still open that little cafe. Maybe they'll plant a new garden. Maybe they'll write another book. But none of that matters more than the certainty they carry in their hearts. They survived the worst. and they survived together. And if life dares to test them again, let it. Because they've already proven that their love isn't made of pretty words, but of deep roots. Unbreakable. Eternal. Because when everything else was gone, the money, the health, the plans, what remained was the essential. Love. The love that chose to stay.